How you doing? It is almost Christmas time, and this is a Christmas time offer for you for being a loyal listener. Join us on Patreon. Join the gang on Patreon. You're going to get first dibs on tickets for Dalkey, for Kilkenomics, and for live podcasts. You're going to be part of our book club, which I'm launching in January. You're going to get access to my monetary economics course, the one I gave in Trinity, and you're going to get a sort of a Substack backdrop of all sorts of articles that go into making these podcasts. So join us, patreon.com/Dave McWilliams between now and Christmas Day, and you get 15% off. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you there? It is time for the how are you doing there? It's time for the pudding.
It's time for the pudding.
It's time for dessert, okay? It's time for the podcast. It's freezing cold. The winter has come. If you had any suspicions that you might have got a mild winter, we are in for a shocker. But John and I are down here in the basement, in the warmth of the basement,
yes,
in the HQ, and we are lamenting the passing of Shane MacGowan. Today's podcast is all about the impact of immigration, demography on economics, on society and culture. And we're going to look at, which is a very Irish podcast today, which is the impact on England of the Irish diaspora. And the reason I'm going to do it is because the Pogues, I think it's fair to say, were the ultimate Irish diaspora bands. They were not of Ireland, they were of the Irish tribe. And I've always said, John, that Ireland isn't so much a nation, it's a tribe. And to be Irish means you're connected to Americans, you're connected to Brits, you're connected to Aussies, you're connected to Canadians, people all over the world. That basically, it's like being part of a big dysfunctional extended family.
Yeah.
And if you look even at this podcast and you look where people listen to, our listeners are from all over the place, but they're part in the main of the Irish tribe all over the world.
Yeah.
And when I'm always thinking about
County North London.
County North London. Well, if you think about Shane MacGowan and you think about the Pogues, what they are, they're a London Irish product. They couldn't have come from here in many ways, exclusively.
Yeah.
But all their cultural inspiration comes from the London Irish community. And I was just even looking.
Which is incredibly unique, by the way.
Yeah, and it's different to us.
Yes, it's different to us, but it's different to the Irish Americans, different to the Irish Australians and all the rest. It has its own kind of, its own sub-tribe.
It has its own sub-tribe. It tends to be a much more working class version of the Irish in America. And it tends to be a newer version in the sense that it got a massive increase and spike or boost by the migration of the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah.
Because there were the parents. And we see that through culture, we see it through music, through history, through art, all that stuff, this impact. We're going to talk about these different waves of Irish people. But you're right, the North London, West London, South, and it's fair to say East London Irish experience is really quite different. And I know, so for example, with someone like MacGowan, when I remember when I first listened to Rum, Sodomy and the Lash, and he wrote about, male prostitution, destitution, being spat on and shat on and raped and abused, all these, and he wrote about an Irish experience that we in Ireland shunned because it didn't accord with our sense of ourselves, number one. And so many of those old guys never came home because they hadn't made it, because they were, even so they couldn't afford a new suit to come home, right?
Yeah.
And MacGowan understood that. And he understood the immigrant experience, and he understood being at the bottom of the pile. And he understood also looking up from the bottom of the pile and thinking, what am I going to do? I mean, just if you listen to, if you are a Pogues fan, you'll know what I'm getting on. If you're not a Pogues fan, go and have a listen thing. And of course, John, you recorded.
Well, I did. Do you know, I had a really weird experience last Thursday when I heard of Shane's passing. And I didn't know him terribly well. I had the privilege of working with him a few times. But last Thursday, I was in a studio. I was in the podcast studio, which is a studio in Dublin, nice setup. And that used to be Westland Studios in the 80s and 90s. And of course, Westland Studios was the place that was my first job as a T-boy and tape op and assistant engineer. And I was in there with clients and I arrived in, and it's changed, but not that much. And I was reminiscing, just looking around the place. That's where I did the first Aslan album, Hot House Flowers, all these guys, Bill Whelan, Mary Black, blah, blah, blah. And of course, one of the albums I did there was the Dubliners 25th celebration. I was one of the assistant engineers on that. And what's on that album? The Irish Rover.
With the Pogues.
So
the iconic version of the
absolutely,
Irish Rover. Yeah.
So we recorded that with the Dubliners, sent over to London. And I can't remember if the Dubliners went over and did the vocals over there or not. Irrelevant. They did some backing tracks and then they all came back. And Shane came back and we were doing the mix session. And that
must have been amazing.
Wild. Jesus Christ. It was wild. But that was the first time I met him. But it was really weird. I was standing in the control room in Westland Studios, the podcast studio, on Thursday, and a text came through from Al saying, R.I.P. Shane MacGowan. I went, what? This was the very room that I first met him.
That's extraordinary.
It was really strange. The second time I worked with him actually was with Steve Lillywhite. And I only did a couple of days on a session of, what was the name of the album? Love and Peace, on the song Boat Train.
I love that song.
Yeah.
But also having got
it's fantastic track.
Having got the boat train. The boat train is the Irish experience.
Yes.
In London.
Yeah.
It is the Irish experience. Well, I'll tell you a story about me, Shane MacGowan, and Iggy Pop.
Oh.
So Iggy Pop is playing in Kilmainham on July of 2008.
Right.
Just as the world economy is crashing all around us, right?
Yes.
As the Irish banks are going bust, as the whole thing is over. And Iggy Pop is playing. I'm going to see Iggy Pop. And John Reynolds, who passed away, the promoter, was an old friend of mine. And John texted me and he said, look, why don't you come? Let's have a quick drink before the gig. There's a bar backstage. So I said, Grant, I go. So I walk into the bar backstage. The only other person at the bar is Shane MacGowan. It was a little small tent. It wasn't a bar. It was just a backstage tent. And like you, Shane MacGowan had kind of deity status for us when we were younger, right?
Yeah.
Particularly when we were living in London as well, right? So I walk up to him and we're at the bar, ordered 2 pints, and amazing, he says to me, I've just read your book.
What?
The Pope's Children.
Oh.
So I'm like, ah. So we start talking about Ireland, Irish society. Yeah. And then there's a couple of pints and a bottle of wine arrived. Yeah. So then Shane says to me, right, it's getting very messy.
Yeah.
And that is because the bar's kind of filling up as well. And then Shane says to me, come on, we'll go to the gig. And I said, how do you mean? He says, let's go backstage. Yeah. So I end up, right? So you imagine there's Iggy Pop. So how mad is an Iggy Pop gig in the first place, right? Yeah. So Iggy Pop, the original punk, right, is there. I'm kneeling down on the side of the stage with 2 bottles of Beaujolais, me and Shane MacGowan, the other punk poet. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, this is mental. And I don't know what was more mental, the fact that it was an economist with Shane MacGowan, listening to Iggy Pop, the fact that it was Iggy Pop. And of course, Iggy Pop was aware that Shane MacGowan was beside us and was kind of genuflecting to the great man. And I'm sitting between these 2 giants.
Maybe he's genuflecting to you, Mac.
Oh, my. Anyway, so I always said Iggy Pop, myself, and Shane MacGowan. And then, of course, the night went on and we went into town and it got very...
Fantastic.
Got very grey and very...
But that was the thing that I everyone talks about Shane MacGowan's drinking and stuff, and Jay-Z was a drinker. But I always thought, I loved Shane MacGowan as a poet. I thought he was fantastic. As a singer, it kind of got to me every so often because when he was singing, you couldn't really hear the lyrics.
Yeah.
But he was such an amazing poet and lyricist. But of course, his singing wasn't about his voice and stuff. His singing was about his delivery.
Yeah.
And that's what it was. You're a great fan of Yeats.
Yeah.
He does an amazing version of An Irish Airman Foretells His Death.
Yeah.
Have you heard
No, I haven't heard it.
Oh, man. It's brilliant. I'll play it for you afterwards.
Well, we should do this. So what we're going to do here, we're talking about Shane MacGowan. We're talking about music. And by the way, I was down I was listening to Other Voices this weekend.
Oh, yeah.
Lucy was down at Other Voices.
How did that go?
Went really, really well. Actually, if you're interested, have a look at Other Voices live on YouTube and you'll get a clip of Lucy. She's 3 or 4 songs there. Lots of other great musicians on it as well. Looks like a great, great gig. I went down there a couple of years ago. Didn't go down this weekend because the last thing you want if you're performing is your owl lad in the crowd. You got to have a certain...
Dad.
Dad, get away from me. But what I want to talk about, John, is this idea of the impact of these Irish people on English culture, right? The NME in the late 1990s, early 2000s, did a review of the 3 most influential musicians on English culture in the last 50 years. One was John Lennon,
Okay.
one was Johnny Rotten, and
Okay.
one was Morrissey, right?
Right.
So what they were saying, these 3 individuals, if you look at these 3 individuals, what actually puts them together is the fact that they are all the sons or grandsons of Irish immigrants to England.
Yeah.
And this intrigued me. So what is it about this tribe that has contributed enormously to Englishness, to what I would call English popular culture?
Yeah.
So then I decided to look at Lennon. And in 1974, Lennon releases an album called Walls and Bridges. And he inserts into this album, into the artwork, a little booklet. And part of this booklet was taken from a geologist called Edward MacLysett. And
Okay.
Edward MacLysett became a member of the first Seanad here. And he was an English guy of Irish parentage who became obsessed by Ireland, went to live in Clare, learned Irish, became a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, ended up being very, very much part of the nationalist movement. And then, when he became a senator, started to write about the ethnicity of Irish names.
Okay.
And one of the names he focuses on is O'Linon, which is obviously Lennon,
Yeah.
because John Lennon's grandparents on both sides were Irish, right? His grandfather was a guy called Jack Lennon, who was a seaman, a merchant navy guy. And in this thing, there is a rather dismissive, snooty thing about the surname O'Lennon, and said, no Lennons have really distinguished themselves in the world of art and culture, right? This is written in 1920, and all John Lennon writes in the little thing is, oh yeah, really? Question mark.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then so you see, so Lennon when he got older
Brilliant.
became, really connected to this idea of this Irish part of his background. And then you think, was that part of the creativity of the Beatles? Was the fact that McCartney's parents or grandparents were also Irish? The fact that Harrison's grandparents were also Irish? And then you think, okay, it's not surprising because Liverpool, 60% of kids in certain suburbs in Liverpool are baptized Catholic, when only 10% of English people are Catholic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah,
Liverpool is the second capital city of these, and these guys are from there, right? And I remember I told you before about going on the lash with Wayne Rooney's granny, right?
Yes.
In the Western approaches.
God, Mike.
But it was one of the great afternoons. It was one of the great afternoons. I was in Fazakerley. Fazakerley is a suburb of Liverpool, right?
Never heard
Full
of
of
it.
paddies, right?
Right.
And I have a bizarre, when I'm doing these sort of
That
research.
sounds like a make-you-up name.
It does, but it's actually a real, and there's Z's and K's, and also it
Right.
doesn't sound Scouse at all, but it's a massive big suburb
Yeah.
in Liverpool. And Fazakerley is very, very close to Croxteth, which is where Wayne
Yes.
Rooney's from.
Yeah.
Okay. And then not to be confused with Toxteth, which is where the riots were in England. One of them is the oldest Irish community and one is the oldest black community. But in Fazakerley, there's a massive, massive cemetery. And cemeteries are very interesting places to look at the demographic echoes of society.
Yes. Yeah.
And what
yeah,
you
yeah.
find in Fazakerley's cemetery, loads and loads of Chinese names, loads of Chinese,
Okay.
like Chinese mausoleums, the early Chinese community in Liverpool, loads of Irish names, loads of Jewish names in the other part of the cemetery. And it's all to do with the fact that Liverpool was a huge melting pot. We forget
Because
that.
it was a massive port.
Massive port.
Yeah,
And that's where
yeah.
the oldest black community is, in Liverpool and
Yeah.
in Bristol.
Yeah.
2 big ports. But interestingly, the afternoon when I went to interview to get a handle on the Irish community in Croxteth for a TV documentary for RTE many, many years ago, we ended up in a pub with a priest, with Father Ince. And Father Ince was the local priest. And he was our in to the community.
Yeah.
And he said to me after a couple of hours of driving around, he goes, let's go for a bevy. So we went in for a bevy. And in the back of the boozer, he says, you're in luck. Wayne's nan's down the back. and down the back was Wayne's nan. And Wayne Rooney's nan's Patricia Fitzsimons, originally from Derry.
Right.
And fantastically, not only
Was she a pool shark down the back?
she was drinking gin and bitter lemon
Right.
at about 11:30 or 12 in the morning, watching the racing from Kempton, right? Kempton Park racing.
Jesus
Lads were
Christ.
being sent out. I mean, this boozer, there's a rule of thumb in England, never go into a boozer with a flat roof.
Right. Go on.
Because they're always RAF, rough as fuck, right?
Makes sense.
All the other rule in England is not only don't go into a boozer with a flat roof, do not go into a boozer with no windows.
Yes.
And the Western Approaches in Croxteth, and I was in this boozer, has no windows and a flat roof.
Is that the name of the Western Approaches?
Yes, and that's the name of the boozer. So you're in this boozer.
Right.
So there's a flat roof. There is no windows.
Tick.
No windows. There's a William Hill bookmaker beside. Tick.
Perfect.
Okay, there are skinny lads in Everton away strips. That's all it is, right?
Yeah, with wispy tashes.
Wispy tashes and no arse, no evidence of an arse, right? No arse on the side of the trousers, right? And then Wayne's granny's down the back. And we went and we chatted. And we had a total laugh in the afternoon. Afternoon went pear-shaped completely. And then we went back and we interviewed her for the TV documentary.
Yeah.
And she was really interested. She was born on St. Patrick's Day, right?
Right, okay.
And she talked about the parades in Liverpool in the 1950s and 1960s, St. Patrick's Day parade. She talked about sectarianism, all that sort of stuff. Fascinating backdrop. But again, it comes to this idea of the impact of this tribe on England, where you have now so many English people identify with Irishness. So many of them, despite Brexit, despite everything.
Yeah.
We kind of forget that these links are very, very strong. And then you look at the other person the enemy talked about was Johnny Rotten. And Johnny Rotten is John Lydon. And Johnny Rotten's parents are, of course, Irish. And his first autobiography was called No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish.
Yeah.
And it was about that. And he is the Finsbury Park Irish that you'd have known in North London.
Yes.
Very close to Shane MacGowan's tribe.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the other person they wrote about was Morrissey. And Morrissey is Stephen Morrissey. And even in that Irish Blood, English Heart, that...
It's a great song, actually. Yeah.
He describes himself as 10 parts Crumlin, 10 parts Old Trafford.
Yeah.
Right? And he's also Robbie Keane's cousin.
Is he?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So these are the whole thing. Robbie Keane, who is now the manager of Maccabi Tel Aviv.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Another place we could go, right? But what I've been always fascinated in is why was there a disproportionate amount of those Irish musicians like the Gallaghers, Pete Doherty, all those people in English popular culture.
So this is kind of the unintended soft power of Ireland.
Yeah.
In England.
And it's like, I remember listening to Steve Coogan talking about it, like Steve Coogan's parents were both Irish. And then you look at comedy and you see this extraordinary footprint of Irish people in English comedy. I'll just give you've got Steve Coogan, Peter Kay, Dave Allen, of course, Spike Milligan, Jimmy Carr, Paul Merton, Caroline Ahern, and of course, up in Scotland, Billy Connolly. So you have this, and it all comes back to this idea that we are so intertwined, ourselves and the English, which is sometimes what I always think was very interesting. Last week, there was this, with the riots, this idea of what is Irishness? These are people are not Irish. And then when you talk sometimes to the sort of the more Provo, the anti-English Provo stuff, right? And then you realize, and you walk around parts of England, that everywhere, you look at the most popular Saturday night shows in England, Ant and Dec.
Yes,
They're paddies. They're Newcastle paddies, right?
Yeah.
You think of, Dermot O'Leary. These are kind of mainstream broadcasters. What you have is an extraordinary duality. And of course, MacGowan was an extreme version of this. But where he got his inspiration was from the Irish experience in England. And it's interesting, the Irish experience. And he also said that the Pogues could never have been Irish born and bred exclusively, because they had to have that nurturing of that slightly outsider, slightly alien. And the best was Boy George, of course, whose name is George O'Dowd, was saying, try and be a cross-dresser in Tipperary in the 80s,
But see, London had its own kind of texture, added its own texture to the Pogues. And it was that punk element.
Yeah.
But overall, how did that soft power influence, politics and economics and where is it headed in the future?
Okay.
But before you answer that, let's have a little break.
Fair enough.
So, Mac, we're talking about, there's a huge influence of Irish people who left here during the famine and the 50s and 60s, and then our generation leaving in the 80s and stuff.
Absolutely. And now our kids.
And now our kids,
Your daughter lives in London. My daughter lives in London.
Absolutely, yeah. And we have this kind of, it's almost like a treadmill.
Yeah.
You go over and you do your time in London and you learn your trade and then of course, a lot of people stay. But what I want to ask you about is the influence, not just the cultural influence, but the political and economic influence of that on English culture.
Well, I think it's not just on English culture, John. I think it's on our culture too. I think that one of the big unstudied parts of economics is the impact of diasporas and the future impact of diasporas on relationships around the world.
Yeah.
So take, for example, we're talking about the Irish in England, right? And we're talking about the Irish in America, right? But an even more fascinating diaspora now are going to be the Indian diaspora in the United States.
Yes.
So if you look at, in business in particular, the footprint of Indian chief executives and starters and founders in Silicon Valley, it's phenomenal. And this is soldering a link between America and India at a supranational, almost, as you say, soft power. Because, India and America were at loggerheads. They couldn't stand it. India always went with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because America backed Pakistan. And of course, who was the architect of that? Mr. Kissinger, who passed away also on the same day as Shane MacGowan.
That's right.
But we're going to talk about Kissinger.
Say they're baiting lumps out of each other.
We're going to, could you imagine the scraps, right? We're going to talk about...
outside the pearly gates.
Exactly. St. Peter is trying to pick the two of them apart. And, Do you remember the post used to bash each other around the head with a biscuit tin? Imagine you have an image of Shane MacGowan bashing Henry Kissinger around the head with a biscuit tin, right? Speaking of Kissinger, we are going to be talking on Thursday to Fiona Hill, who is the advisor, the advisor to the Secretary of State on all things Russian, Ukrainian. We're also going to ask her about the legacy of Kissinger. But we'll park it with the image of Shane MacGowan hitting Henry Kissinger across the head with a USA biscuit tin outside the pearly gates, right? But back to this impact, the impacts of the Chinese diaspora on the United States and on the relationship between the United States and China. These are going to be huge, right? We know about the Jewish diaspora and the influence of them in America and financing Israel, all that stuff, right? So what we don't realize is that there are links that go deeper than economics, and they're familial links, they're bloodline links, they're cultural links, and they are extraordinarily strong. And in a globalized world where things become sanitized and things become equal, and the difference between cultures becomes equalized because of the global talent and media being globalized, ideas of ethnicity are unbelievably powerful. This is why years ago, I was very agitating for this idea of the Global Irish Forum, because it is something deep, right? There are connections between people that are emotional connections. And these emotional connections are the basis of soft power.
But can I just, this is part of the argument against immigration that the right wing profess, that, it's the great replacement theory that you hear the likes of Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon bang on about another Irish guy.
Steve Bannon is a paddy. Yeah,
banging on about, and how, all this immigration is going to
dilute the culture. And you feel like saying to them, well, hold on a second, right? If that is the case, if immigration and migration into the country, people feel might dilute the culture, well, how do you actually, in the 21st century, deal with that? And how maybe you deal with this is you look at the Constitution and what is Irishness, right? Or what is Englishness, or what is Frenchness, okay? Now, if you take it as just an ethno-nationalist idea, that you all have to look and sound like us, right? That's one way. And have to have been born on this island, right? Could you imagine how shite the Irish football team would have been over the years if we adopted the Steve Bannon approach to Irishness?
Yeah.
So you would have no Kevin Sheedy's, right? Think about it, right? Look, why was Jack Charlton's football team good? Because he went and took all the kids of Irish immigrants in England, from Mick McCarthy to Alan McLaughlin to Tony Galvin. Like, think about that whole team.
Apparently they weren't all Irish. All have links.
That was Tony Cascarino, who admitted, Big Tone, Big Cass. Yeah, he's actually pure Italian, had no Irish at all. But You see, I would contrast Steve Bannon's worldview with Jack Charlton's worldview. Jack Charlton's worldview was inclusive and was suggestive. He was much closer, for example, to Shane MacGowan, because what he was saying is there is a tribe in America or in England or in Canada that are of Irish descent and they're part of our tribe, right? Now, if Steve Bannon wins, what you're going to say is only the couple of million people who are born here require to be regarded as Irish. That's complete nonsense. In the future, I happen to think, I was reading about Napoleon, John, during the week, because today is the anniversary of the victory of Austerlitz, which is when Napoleon was crowned Emperor of France. And I was also reading the diaries of a fellow called Talleyrand, who was Napoleon's foreign minister, who Napoleon referred to as shite in silk stockings, which is an amazing put down. You'd always be proud to be shite in silk stockings, right? But I'm reading this for another project.
By the way, I'm going to see the movie tonight. I'll report back.
Okay, you're going to see Napoleon, right?
Yeah.
Napoleon, the first incarnation of the French Republic, right? Republican values, this amazing revolution the French had. The French now they're on their fifth republic, which is what I like about the French. It's like every couple of decades, they say, okay, enough of that. We're going to change the republic. We're going to change the constitution. The fifth republic comes in 1958 against the background of the Algerian War. They had a system like ours, which was a PR system and a sort of a ceremonial president. So the parliament was sovereign. And this was not working because the parliament was unable, because they had all these unstable coalitions to actually make decisions about decolonialization, what France was after the Second World War, what the country was going to be. And of course, waiting in the wings was the 20th century version of Napoleon, Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle is sitting in the wings, retired, and Charles is waiting for the call-up, right? He's the big man, l'homme providentiel, okay? And he's the big man in history, and he gets a call, and he says, okay, I'm going to rewrite the constitution. We're going to have a fifth republic, and we're going to put the president is going to be, the executive power is all going to be in the president. And he is going to have certain areas of total competence, right? A bit like the American system. Because this idea
how could he have the power to just change it like that? Was it a kind of a unilateral decision?
No. The parliament came to him and said, we need a new fix, right? But in the French political culture, go back to Napoleon, is this idea of the big man, of the top dog, right? We don't have that. The Yanks have it too. Yeah. So the Yanks have the executive power and the president, right? But what I'm talking about, to tie it all together, right, is that in the next 10 or 15 years, I believe we need to have a second republic in Ireland, because I think the society and the way in which we're running the economy has broken down. So why can't we build houses? Why can't we build infrastructure? Why can't the cops control the streets? It's all to do with a lack of connection. We feel that our political class should be able to click their fingers or pick up the phone and make something happen. Yeah. But they don't, because they're hamstrung by bureaucracy and layers, maybe mediocrity, right? So what you have, this weird situation, is politicians in Ireland come on the radio trying to explain themselves as if these guys can pick up the phone and change. But they can't, because there's no executive powers. So the government in Ireland is hamstrung by the fact that we have a system, even building houses, right?
But hang on. We used to do that, though, didn't we? So what has changed?
What has changed is that the population has grown dramatically. Yeah. Right? Is that the demands on infrastructure have grown dramatically. And the way it ties in with everything is that Ireland, because of emigration, was a society run for 100 years based on a declining population. Now imagine this, okay? A declining population means you do not have to replace anything, because you've less people coming through. So if you think from 1922 until around 2002, the population of Ireland hardly moved. Yeah. That's a very easy place to run. From 2002 to now, the population has increased by 1 million. Yeah. And it's going to increase, and it's increasing now. Because the population is increasing, the way in which you did business in the old days is null and void, because the demands on the public system are so enormous, right? And so consequently, this idea of having a political system of PR, do you know what's going to happen in Ireland next year? We're going to increase the amount of TDs. Right? Yeah. Okay. That doesn't look to me like reform. That looks to me like packing an already packed deck. Having more people in the Dáil is hardly political reform. It's hardly taking the political, economic and social structure and saying, is this fit for purpose?
So are you saying, though, then, that the PR system that we have doesn't work? Like, it's the system itself doesn't work, because a PR system by its very nature gives rise to a weak government, a wishy-washy government, because it's so diluted down that there's no single strong party or leader.
No, so I don't think, I mean, I think that's one way you can go down. I'm not a great believer in the big man in history, right? The strong man.
Yeah.
But I do understand that the French are onto something, which is at a certain stage, decisions have to be taken.
Yeah.
So you have the PR system is extremely adept and adroit at creating centrist governments. And that makes sense because most people are centrist. What people don't realize is, thankfully, Twitter isn't the electorate, okay? Yes. So all the shouting and roaring in social media isn't where most people sit. Most people are in the middle in some shape or form. They tend to do the most sensible thing. They tend to probably default to conservatism at a certain level, i.e., they're not revolutionary in the main, right? So PR has a great ability to reflect that. However, what is a problem is when the state needs to get things done quickly. The PR system or the governance that has risen up with the PR system doesn't do urgency very well.
But here's another thing, though, that when it does do that, on the very rare occasion, such as in COVID lockdowns,
exactly,
that people are up shouting, roaring that it's a fascist state. Then
only some people. You're on X too much.
Yeah, I'm off X actually.
The vast majority of people went along with this and were quite happy that a large paternalistic government.
But is that group, small group, and they're the fellas that we saw out in the streets and all of that, is that not growing? Or certainly that's the perception.
It is growing. It is growing. But as Kevin Cunningham said last week, it's still very marginal, right? It's still a very marginal group, okay? Now, it could grow, right? It could well grow, and there's reasons to think it should grow. But what I think is, if it is growing, right? If the governance needs to be changed, if the society is changing completely from the society that De Valera wrote the Constitution in 1937 about, then we have a legal and economic and social and political imperative to consider the Second Republic. We've had our First Republic. Also think about Northern Ireland, right? What's coming down the tracks there is some constitutional change. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but it gives the opportunity to change in advance of the Constitution. So basically, use the border poll with Northern Ireland or some change like this to basically, is this place fit for purpose? If we had a blank slate, John, if you had a blank piece of paper, would you start from here? That's the idea. And the French have the political maturity to take those big decisions. And maybe we should contemplate a second Irish Republic.
So, okay, let me ask you then, because France have the Gilets Jaunes on the streets and farmers blocking streets. But what would a Irish Second Republic look like?
I think that a presidential system, which we've got Michael D as a symbolic president, okay? And I think that works for a lot of areas.
Yeah.
But what should the new republic look like? What should the executive powers be, right? So I think we could do it through citizens' assemblies, right? So you'd have an organic way of feeling your way towards. You could have a lot more direct democracy like the Swiss have. So you basically take the power away from the parliament and give it back to local government.
Yeah.
Because local government, it's what Eric Lonergan said the other week, information is always better locally because you know exactly what people are thinking, right? The farther away you are from information, the more likely your executive decisions will be bad, right? So you've got to empower local government. So maybe you take direct democracy. Maybe we do the opposite of the French and we say, we will not centralize power. We will diffuse power completely to the local area. And we'll do this under the auspices of a Second Republic. And that's where, to get back to our theme, the diaspora come in. So I believe that we should use Ireland as the recharging battery for the Irishness of the tribe. So we started with the idea that we are a tribe.
Yeah.
And that tribe is much more closely aligned with each other than many other nations, right? Which is why we go to Irish bars, which is in Irish America, which is the Pogues, what we're talking about. We in the country, the motherland, so to speak, right? We should give those Irish immigrants, like our kids who go abroad, they should have some way of voting here. So in all other republics, French Republic, Polish Republic, if you see, for example, when there's Brazilian elections in Brazil, there's lines of Brazilians up here queuing to vote. When there's French elections, there's lines of French people queuing to vote. No Irish people who live outside the country have the right to vote here. Yet they're all Irish citizens and they all have a view, and maybe they have a better view because they're outside the country. And I think that if we want to combat the Steve Bannon idea, right, the replacement theory idea, what we've got to say is that Irishness is an active element. And by an active element, I mean the island produces the culture that informs, infuses, and helps the diaspora. And they produce something unique for us, which is an outside experience. And the way to gel these all together is in this new Second Republic, where they have some share and some say in the way in which the country is run. Not because you're going to give people who don't pay taxes in your country a right to vote, and therefore they have some sort of representation without taxation, to go back to the American democratic ideal. But it's because it's unique. It is unique that there is no English version of the Pogues, an English band playing English folk music who were born in Canada. They don't exist, right? There is no French version of the Pogues. There is no German version. So this is a unique tribe. And like everything unique, John, we have to protect it. In a world that is changing dramatically, the uniqueness of the Irish tribe outside is something that if we allow this to wither on the vine, if we allow this to say, oh, well, they just come home and they're not really part of our country, you lose something. And in a world of soft power, if you lose the very element, the very driving force of soft power, then you lose everything.